It started like any other morning. San Antonio was still waking up. The street was quiet. No traffic. No voices. The storefront sat dark, lights off, doors locked. Nothing looked unusual. Nothing felt urgent. January 29, 2007. This was the last morning Amber Belken was seen. Inside, the silence lingered longer than it should have. Outside, time moved on as usual. There were no alarms. No warnings. No signs that anything had gone wrong. Just an ordinary start to a day that hours later would raise questions. No one was prepared to answer. Before that morning ever arrived, life felt settled. Not dramatic. Not rushed. Just steady. Amber Belken was born on December 6, 1981, in San Antonio, Texas. She was an only child, raised in a home where attention was constant and care was never in short supply. Her parents were present, consistent, the kind who showed up without being asked. Growing up, Amber had a habit that became familiar. She noticed what others didn't. If an animal seemed lost or overlooked, she stopped. If something needed care, she felt responsible. She brought them home. Cats, dogs, turtles, frogs, whatever crossed her path and needed help. Her parents allowed it. Every time, the house adjusted. Not because it was easy, but because it mattered to her. That sense of care stayed with her. It didn't fade with age. It sharpened. Friends later described Amber as calm and dependable. She wasn't loud. She didn't chase attention. She preferred routines. Familiar places. Predictable days. If she made a commitment, she kept it. If someone relied on her, she didn't disappoint. As she grew older, her love for animals became a plan. Not a vague idea. Not a childhood phase. She wanted to become a veterinarian, and she worked toward it patiently. After high school, she made a practical choice. Before college, she wanted to save money. So she took a job at a video game store. It was meant to be temporary. Just a step along the way. But Amber treated the job seriously. She arrived early, learned procedures, followed rules. People noticed. She earned trust. Then responsibility. Before long, she was promoted. Eventually, she became the store manager. For nearly 3 years, she ran the location, handled schedules, held keys, managed routines. Quietly reliable. Outside of work, life stayed simple. Regular phone calls with her parents. Familiar routines. Evenings that felt predictable. Nothing reckless. Nothing uncertain. In 2007, at 25 years old, she enrolled in veterinary classes at a nearby college. It felt earned. Like the next natural step. To those who knew her, everything seemed intact. Her life felt balanced. Supported. Moving forward. There was no sense of urgency. No visible cracks. No reason to believe anything was about to change. Just a woman building the future she had always planned for. One careful decision at a time. On the surface, everything seemed fine. Nothing stood out. Nothing demanded attention. The video game store followed a routine. The same doors. The same counters. The same morning process, day after day. Amber worked there to save money. It was practical. Temporary. A step before something else. But over time, the routine settled in. She learned how everything worked. How the store opened. How the day flowed. She was promoted. Then trusted with more responsibility. Eventually, she became the manager. For nearly 3 years, the pattern stayed the same. Schedules were written. Keys were signed out. Opening times were fixed. Amber was known for being punctual. Reliable. The person expected to be there first. Most mornings looked identical. She arrived early, unlocked the doors, prepared the store before opening. Customers came and went. Games were bought. Receipts printed. Nothing out of place. From the outside, it was ordinary retail work. Predictable. Unremarkable. In 2007, she enrolled in veterinary classes nearby. Work continued. School fit around it. Nothing felt rushed. Nothing felt unstable. Her days were full but manageable, balanced between responsibility and routine. To co-workers, everything looked normal. To management, operations ran smoothly. To anyone passing by, it was just another store. There were no emergency calls, no complaints reaching corporate, no reason for concern. If a detail didn't line up perfectly, it was easy to explain away. Busy schedules do that. Routine creates confidence. It convinces people things are under control. So when the store didn't open right away, no one panicked. At least not at first. Because when life follows a pattern long enough, you start to trust it. January 29th began like any other workday. Amber was scheduled to open the store. She always did. The opening time came and passed. The doors stayed locked. The lights stayed off. At first, no one worried. Small delays happen. Traffic. A late alarm. A simple mix-up. Minutes passed. Then more. Inside the store, nothing moved. No lights. No sound. Only stillness. The phone rang. Then rang again. No answer. Management tried Amber's cell phone. It went unanswered. They waited. Then tried again. Still nothing. The routine had been broken. That was the first quiet warning. Amber was known for being punctual. Early most days. She didn't miss openings. She didn't forget schedules. So when the store remained closed, questions began to surface. Not panic. Not yet. Just uncertainty. Another call was placed. This time to the store's landline. It rang into silence. Outside, the day moved forward. Cars passed. Nearby businesses opened. Customers noticed the dark storefront and kept walking. By mid-morning, management grew uneasy. This wasn't like her. Something felt off, even if no one could explain it. They checked the schedule again. Confirmed the opening time. Confirmed Amber was assigned. There was no mistake. The store should have been open. Management contacted a nearby location. They asked if someone could stop by, just to check on things. An employee named Giovanni agreed to go. The request was simple. Look through the windows. See if anything seemed unusual. When Giovanni arrived, the scene looked unchanged. The store was dark. The doors were locked. No movement inside. He walked around the building. Checked the windows. Nothing appeared out of place. Giovanni reported back. Everything looked quiet. So they waited. More time passed. The morning drifted toward noon. Calls continued. Still no response. Eventually, management asked Giovanni to return, just to be sure. By now, the routine felt fully undone. What should have been predictable had become uncertain. The store still hadn't opened. Amber still hadn't answered. When Giovanni arrived the second time, something was different. The lights were still off. The doors were still locked. But this time, there was someone inside. It was another employee. His name was Brandon. Brandon was standing inside the store. In the dark. Behind locked doors. At that moment, no one understood what it meant. It didn't feel like an explanation. It felt like another unanswered question. What began as a minor delay had quietly shifted into something else. There were no alarms. No clear warnings. Only absence. A missing routine. An unanswered phone. A store that should have been open, but wasn't. Silence had replaced predictability. And once that happened, nothing felt ordinary anymore. This was the moment unease truly settled in. Not suddenly. Not loudly. But slowly. The store still looked closed from the outside. Dark windows. Locked doors. Nothing to explain the delay. Earlier that morning, the first check revealed nothing. No movement. No obvious signs of trouble. Just a quiet storefront that didn't make sense. But now, hours later, everything felt different. When the door was unlocked, the silence changed. Not louder. Heavier. Inside, the lights were still off. The store felt hollow. Unfamiliar. That's when the disorder became visible. Game cases were scattered across the floor. Items were out of place. The careful order of the store was gone. The cash register sat open. Bills lay exposed. Unattended. It didn't look like a normal workday. It didn't look like a simple mistake. One of the coworkers moved deeper inside. Toward the manager's office. A space usually kept closed. Controlled. Private. The office door was open. That detail stopped everything. Inside, something was wrong. Not just misplaced. Not just disorganized. Someone was lying on the floor. There was no movement. No response. In that moment, confusion gave way to clarity. Whatever had happened here was far beyond a late opening or a missed call. The store was no longer just a workplace. It was something else now. The call was made immediately. Authorities were contacted. Help was requested. Within minutes, the area began to change. The store was closed off. Access restricted. The routine permanently broken. Officers arrived and took control. The doors were sealed. The lights remained off. Outside, the day continued. Cars passed. People went about their lives, unaware of what had just been discovered behind dark glass. Inside, time felt suspended. The unanswered calls, the missed opening, the quiet morning, all of it now pointed to a moment no one could undo. This was the point of no return. From here on, nothing would be simple. Nothing would be assumed. Every detail would matter. What began as a concern had become something irreversible. The tone had shifted permanently. And from this moment forward, the questions would no longer be about where Amber was, but about what had happened inside that store. During the hours no one was watching. Once authorities arrived, the focus shifted quickly. The store was secured. Access was limited. The ordinary rules no longer applied. From the outside, it looked straightforward. A retail location. A disrupted interior. Items missing. At first glance, it resembled a theft. Money was gone. Several gaming consoles were missing. Dozens of game discs had disappeared. On paper, the numbers added up. Cash from the register. Property from the shelves. Thousands of dollars unaccounted for. That initial assessment shaped the early thinking. Someone had come in for valuables. Someone had taken what they could carry. But investigators don't stop at first impressions. They slow things down. They retrace steps. They look for patterns that don't fit. The first question wasn't what was taken. It was how the store was entered. There were no signs of forced entry. No damaged locks. No broken glass. The doors had been locked when employees arrived earlier. That detail mattered. If someone had entered by force, there would have been evidence of it. There wasn't. That raised a new possibility. Whoever entered the store may not have needed to break in at all. Investigators turned their attention to the layout. The front entrance. The back door. The narrow alley behind the building. The back door opened into a row of nearly identical entrances. From the alley, there was no clear signage. No easy way to tell which door led where. Unless you already knew. That detail lingered. Inside, the disorder told its own story. The register had been opened. The safe in the manager's office had been accessed. Those weren't random actions. They required familiarity, timing, confidence. Someone knew where to go and what to touch. Then there was Amber's car. It was still parked outside, unlocked. Her phone resting inside. That didn't align with a sudden departure. It didn't suggest she had stepped out willingly. If she had left briefly, why leave her phone behind? Investigators noted it carefully. Phones don't get forgotten easily, especially by someone known for being organized. That detail introduced a new question. Why would a person intent on theft leave so many loose ends behind? The next step was documentation. Every item missing was logged. Every surface photographed. Every path through the store mapped. What emerged was a picture of control, not chaos. The register wasn't damaged. The safe wasn't forced open. They were accessed. That narrowed the field. People unfamiliar with the store would have struggled. They would have made mistakes, left obvious signs. None were present. Investigators considered the timing. The event appeared to have happened early, before customers, before neighboring businesses were fully active. That window was precise. It suggested planning. And then there was the question no one wanted to ask out loud yet. Why did this situation escalate? If the goal had been money, access had already been granted. The register and safe had been opened. There was no clear reason for what followed. That gap in logic became impossible to ignore. Investigators reviewed the routine. Amber arrived early. She followed procedure. She handled deposits. If someone had confronted her immediately, they would have gained access quickly. But that still didn't explain everything. Another question surfaced. Why take property at all? If the goal was already achieved, the missing items could have been a distraction, an attempt to reshape the narrative, to make it look simpler than it was. At this stage, nothing was ruled out. But the theory of a random break-in was losing ground. The store didn't have internal cameras. Unlike other locations in the chain, this one was unmonitored. That absence mattered. Someone familiar with company practices would have known that. Investigators began to consider the possibility that the situation had been staged. Not carelessly, deliberately. They looked again at the doors. Locked earlier, unlocked later. They looked at the alley, at how easily someone could come and go without being seen. They looked at the missing items, at how selectively they were taken. Each detail pointed in the same direction. This wasn't random. It wasn't impulsive. It suggested familiarity with the store, with the routine, with Amber herself. That realization marked a turning point. From that moment on, the investigation shifted. The focus moved inward, toward people who knew the space, who understood the schedule, who had access without raising suspicion. The viewer is left with the same questions investigators faced. If there was no forced entry, how did someone get inside? If the goal was theft, why did the situation go further? And if this wasn't random, then who knew enough to make it look that way? As the tape went up, and evidence logs filled, one thing became clear. What looked simple at first was anything but, and the answers would not be found by looking at strangers passing by the store, but by examining the people who already knew what waited behind those doors. As the focus narrowed, one name moved to the center of the investigation. Not because of proof, but because of proximity. Brandon worked at the store. He knew the routines. He knew the layout. And on that morning, he was there. Investigators returned to the timeline. They replayed it carefully, minute by minute. Giovanni's second visit mattered. That was when Brandon was seen inside, standing in the dark, behind locked doors. That image stayed with investigators. When questioned, Brandon explained his presence. He said he believed he might have misunderstood the schedule, that maybe it was his responsibility to open. So he let himself inside. Inside, he noticed disorder, items out of place, the register open. But he didn't react the way investigators expected. He didn't call anyone right away. He didn't leave in a hurry. He didn't search for answers. Instead, he stayed. To investigators, that behavior raised questions. Why didn't the disorder trigger alarm? Why didn't he immediately report it? Brandon said he assumed the mess had been left behind, that he worried he might be blamed, that he didn't think something serious had happened. Investigators listened. They didn't challenge him yet. They documented everything. Then they learned more. Co-workers mentioned tension. Not recent arguments. Not public confrontations. But ongoing frustration. Amber had complained about Brandon's work performance. She had raised concerns. She had spoken to management. There was a record. More than that, she had planned to take action. A formal message. A complaint intended to be sent that morning. That detail carried weight. To investigators, it suggested motive. A reason for resentment. A reason for conflict. Access and motive. Together, they form a pattern investigators are trained to notice. At this stage, Brandon became the focus. Not the answer, but a possibility. Investigators brought him in. Again and again. They asked about his movements, his morning, his timing. They asked about the store, the office, the disorder. They asked about Amber, their working relationship, the complaint. Brandon denied any involvement. Consistently, calmly. Still, investigators pushed forward. They requested phone records, location data, time stamps. The results shifted the narrative. Brandon's phone data placed him elsewhere. Not near the store. Not during the critical window. The timing didn't line up. Investigators double-checked, then checked again. The data held. Brandon also provided an alibi. He said he had spent the morning with his fiancée and her parents, helping, running errands. Investigators verified it. Every detail. The alibi held too. This was the moment the case resisted certainty. Everything felt suspicious, but nothing proved it. The planned complaint still mattered. The behavior inside the store still raised questions. But questions are not conclusions. Investigators searched Brandon's home, his vehicle, his phone. They found nothing. No missing property. No unexplained items. No digital traces tying him to what happened. The absence became as important as the suspicion. Investigators don't move on easily. They are trained to test theories until they break. So they kept testing this one. They re-examined the timeline, replayed the calls, reviewed the visits. Every angle led back to the same result. The theory didn't hold. Eventually, investigators had to accept it. As uncomfortable as it felt, Brandon could not have been there. When everything unfolded, the suspicion lingered longer than the evidence justified. That happens in complex cases. When a person is close. When behavior feels wrong. When timing creates coincidence. But investigations are built on facts, not instincts. Slowly, Brandon was ruled out. Quietly. Without ceremony. There was no announcement. No clear moment of closure. For Brandon, the weight didn't lift right away. For weeks, he had lived under scrutiny. So had the people around him. The experience left marks. Even without charges. Even without accusations spoken aloud. For investigators, the lesson was familiar. Early conclusions can mislead. The most obvious answer is not always the correct one. This phase of the case became a reminder. Proximity is not proof. Behavior is not evidence. And suspicion, no matter how strong, must give way to verification. With Brandon cleared, the investigation reset. Not back to the beginning, but to a wider field. The questions returned. If not him, then who? If not conflict, then what? And most importantly, how had the early signs pointed so clearly in the wrong direction? As investigators moved forward, they carried that caution with them, because the next name they considered would have to withstand more than suspicion. It would have to withstand facts. With one theory exhausted, investigators turned outward again. They widened the circle. They looked at everyone close to Amber. Attention shifted briefly to her personal life. Her boyfriend was questioned. His timeline examined. His movements verified. The result was familiar by now. The facts didn't support suspicion. He was cleared. And with that, the case slowed. The momentum investigators had built began to fade. There were no new leads. No fresh evidence. No overlooked footage waiting to be found. The store had no internal cameras. Nearby businesses offered little help. The alley provided no answers. The investigation boards filled quickly at first. Photos. Timelines. Memes. Then, slowly they stopped changing. Outside the station, life continued. Inside, the questions remained. Amber's funeral took place days later. Family, friends, co-workers gathered. Grief filled the room in quiet ways. There were no speeches promising resolution. No assurances that answers were close. Only loss. And waiting. As weeks passed, investigators faced a hard reality. Without new information, there was nowhere else to go. They revisited old details. Reviewed calls again. Checked records already checked. Nothing moved. Eventually, law enforcement made a public appeal. A press conference was held. Cameras lined up. Statements were read carefully. Amber's parents stood nearby. Steady. Composed. Holding on to hope. Authorities asked the public for help. Any detail. Any memory. Anything that might have been overlooked. A reward was announced. A significant one. Most of it funded by the company Amber worked for. The message was clear. Someone out there knew something. For a moment, it worked. Tips came in. Phone calls. Emails. Anonymous messages. Each one was logged. Each one evaluated. But one by one, they led nowhere. Some were misunderstandings. Some were rumors. Others fell apart under scrutiny. As the weeks turned into months, the calls slowed. The investigation boards began to look bare. Photos faded. Notes stopped moving. The case grew quiet. Inside the department, it became harder to justify resources. Other cases demanded attention. New emergencies replaced old questions. This is how cases stall. Not suddenly, but gradually. Time became the biggest obstacle. Amber's name still sat on files. Still lived in conversations. But progress had stopped. Investigators worried about something else too. That silence favors one side. Months passed. 7 of them. Then, unexpectedly, the phone rang. The call didn't come from the public line. It wasn't loud. It wasn't confident. The man on the other end asked to remain anonymous. He said he had information. Important information. At first, he spoke carefully, vaguely, as if testing whether he could trust the person listening. Investigators didn't rush him. They listened. He said the information involved someone he knew. Someone connected to the store. Someone connected to Amber. That was enough to reopen the file. Over time, the caller agreed to meet. Not immediately. Fear slowed him down. When he finally sat with investigators, the tone changed. What he shared reframed the entire case. He explained that, the day before Amber disappeared, a conversation had taken place. A suggestion made. An idea presented as easy. He said he had refused it. Walked away. At the time, it didn't seem important. Until the next day. When news broke about Amber, the realization came quickly. The person who had made that suggestion worked in the same retail chain. Someone who knew the stores, the routines. And it wasn't the person investigators had focused on earlier. The witness named Giovanni. He described a meeting that took place the day after Amber vanished. A conversation that shifted suddenly. According to the witness, Giovanni spoke openly. Too openly. He didn't hint. He didn't dance around it. He claimed responsibility. The room went quiet. For investigators, this was the moment the case restarted. The witness explained why he waited. Pure and simple. He believed that if someone could do what had been done, they could silence him too. What made his account more significant was his personal connection. He knew Amber. He knew Giovanni. They had worked together before. That shared history explained details investigators couldn't. Why there was no forced entry. Why the store layout mattered. Why trust may have played a role. With that statement, the case shifted direction. Investigators moved carefully. A single witness isn't enough. But it's a spark. They brought Giovanni in for questioning. He denied everything. Consistently. Firmly. There was no confession. No breakdown. Without physical proof, the path forward was uncertain. Prosecutors reviewed the information. They hesitated. A case built on statements alone is fragile. But the silence was broken now. And once that happens, a case is never truly cold again. The investigation had found its breath. What had collapsed under time was beginning to rise. Slowly, carefully, and for the first time in months. The question wasn't if answers might come, but whether they would arrive. Before time erased them again. With a new statement on record, investigators shifted their attention carefully. Not with certainty, with caution. One name now sat quietly at the center of the file. Giovanni. He was not a stranger to the store. He had worked within the same retail chain. He understood the environment, the routines, the expectations. That familiarity mattered. According to the witness, Giovanni knew how the stores operated. He knew which locations had internal cameras. And more importantly, which ones did not. This store fell into that category. Investigators revisited what they already knew. No internal monitoring. No forced entry. A sequence that suggested comfort inside the space. Someone who belonged there. Or at least appeared to. The witness described a shared history. Not distant. Not casual. They had crossed paths repeatedly. Worked alongside one another. That connection gave weight to the account. It explained how trust could exist without hesitation. Why access might not have raised concern. Investigators began mapping possibilities again. Not conclusions. Possibilities. They looked at the alley behind the store. The identical doors. The lack of clear markings. To someone unfamiliar, it would have been confusing. To someone who knew the layout, it would have been simple. They reviewed company practices. Which locations had cameras? Which ones didn't? That knowledge wasn't public. It was internal. Slowly, the pieces began to align. Not enough to accuse. Enough to question. Giovanni was brought in. The room was small. Neutral. Quiet. Investigators asked him about his connection to the store. About his schedule. About his movements. They asked about the witness. About the conversation that had taken place. Giovanni denied everything. There was no hesitation. No visible shift in tone. No moment that suggested uncertainty. He said he had nothing to do with what happened. That he had never said what the witness claimed. That the story was false. Investigators pressed. They changed angles. They introduced details slowly. Still, the answer didn't change. Denial alone isn't unusual. It's expected. What mattered was what investigators didn't have. There was no physical trace linking him to the store. No usable forensic material. No footage. No direct proof. The witness account stood alone. And that made the case fragile. Investigators documented everything. Every word. Every reaction. Then they took it to the district attorney. The review was careful. Measured. They listened. Asked questions. Read transcripts. And hesitated. A single statement, even a detailed one, is rarely enough to move forward. Without supporting evidence, the risk was clear. A case like this could fall apart in court. And once that happens, it's difficult to recover. Reluctantly, the decision was made. There wasn't enough to proceed. Giovanni was released. For investigators, it was frustrating. They believed the statement mattered. But belief isn't enough. They needed something more. Anything. They looked again at timing. At access. At behavior. Nothing surfaced. At this stage, the investigation stood on a thin edge. 1 step forward. 2 steps back. Giovanni returned to his life. Outwardly unchanged. But investigators kept watching. Quietly. They knew something else too. Pressure changes behavior. Sometimes, it doesn't happen in the interview room. Sometimes, it happens later. The case remained open. Not resolved. Not dismissed. Just waiting. Waiting for a detail. A mistake. A moment when silence breaks. For now, there was no confirmation. No announcement. No resolution. Only a name. A statement. And a question that refused to go away. If this person knew the store. If he understood the blind spots. If trust had opened the door. Then the answers were closer than they seemed. But until something shifted, those answers remained just out of reach. And the investigation, once again, held its breath. The break did not come from a tip line. It came from inside a home. Months after investigators first questioned Giovanni, they received a call they hadn't expected. It was from his wife. At first, she had defended him, believed him, trusted his explanations. But something changed. She told investigators that after authorities requested a DNA sample, Giovanni's behavior shifted. Almost immediately, he told her they needed to leave, to pack quickly, to start over somewhere else. They moved south, closer to the border. That decision raised alarms. In her statement, she described conversations that followed. Moments when fear replaced doubt. Moments when questions were finally answered. According to her account, Giovanni admitted responsibility for what had happened at the store. He described it as something that had gone wrong during a theft. Something he said he never intended to escalate. For investigators, this was the confirmation they had been waiting for. Not clarity, but direction. Soon after, Giovanni crossed into Mexico. With that, the search expanded. Border imagery filled the file. Time stamps. International coordination. U.S. Marshals became involved. So did Mexican authorities. Weeks later, Giovanni was located at a relative's home, just miles from the border. He was taken into custody without incident. Extradition took time. Negotiations followed. Legal conditions were set. To bring him back, prosecutors agreed to remove the most severe sentencing options. It was the only way forward. Once returned, Giovanni accepted a plea agreement in exchange for a life sentence. With the possibility of parole decades later, he agreed to provide a limited account. Not everything, only part. He described entering the store, taking money and property, and a confrontation that spiraled beyond control. Investigators were not convinced by every detail. Some explanations didn't align with the evidence. Others raised new questions, but the agreement closed the case. In court, documents were read. Statements entered. A sentence imposed. For Amber's family, it was an ending without full answers. Justice, but not clarity. Some details remain unknown. What was planned? What wasn't? What truly happened in those early hours? That silence still lingers. The case was resolved, but not entirely explained. And for those who followed it closely, the resolution brought something quieter than relief. It brought finality. The street is quiet again. Cars pass without slowing. The storefront still stands, unchanged from the outside. Ordinary places have a way of hiding what once happened inside them. That's what makes them dangerous. Nothing warns you. Nothing signals risk. Looking back, there were signs. Small ones. Easy to dismiss. Trust given too freely. Routines followed without question. Trust was used against the very people who relied on it. For those closest to the investigation, there was no clean ending. Only consequences that stretched forward in time. Brandon, once under suspicion, was eventually cleared. But clearance doesn't erase weeks of doubt, or the quiet weight of being watched. He rebuilt his life slowly. Away from the store. Away from the questions. For Amber's family, answers came without completeness. Resolution without peace. This story didn't end with certainty. It ended with awareness. Because this wasn't just a crime. It was a pattern no one interrupted. If this case held your attention, subscribe to Iman Crime Files for more documented investigations. New cases are uploaded regularly. Most crimes don't begin with violence. They begin with silence.